It often gets forgotten that the single most important factor in music history in the last 500 years was the invention of recording. Recording changed so many forms of music, and in many cases, it created forms of music. The reason for this is because recording was able to take things like improvisation and feel and turn those into solid compositional devices. Before recording, if you wanted to record a piece of music, you had to write it down on a piece of paper. Only certain elements could be transmitted on that piece of paper. And so the music that was created through this system emphasized those elements that could be transmitted on that piece of paper. When recording was invented, it was originally used to record light opera, classical music, even people reciting Shakespeare. It took people a long time to get around to start recording folk music. Folk music contained elements that you couldn't write down, especially the music that had come out of America at the turn of the century. Jazz and blues contained improvisational elements. And these bands, if they went into a recording studio, could adapt on the spot to make the most out of the recording studio. Jazz musicians, especially people like Jelly Roll Morton and Louis Armstrong, were the first musicians to actually utilize the recording studio to create compositions. In other words, they were using the way the recording studio works to create the compositions. They weren't just merely photographing what was going on. They were actually making a painting out of the elements of the recording studio. As technology developed, this became more and more apparent. So musicians in the past who couldn't have composed because they hadn't studied the techniques and approaches in Western European classical music that you need to know to get the stuff down on paper, could now bring in their compositional vision, but in another way. Now, recording really instigates the music business, commercial music making, popular music. We could see the music business really in the 20th century as being the recording business. It was the commercialization of the products created through recording. As technology developed, this became bigger and bigger, and more outlandish things were achieved as we went from singles to albums, from mono to stereo, to multitrack recording, and eventually digital recording. When rock and roll emerges in the mid-50s and turns into rock music in the 60s, it's at the time when recording technology is going through another revolution. This revolution was really based upon multitrack recording. We start the 1960s with most recordings being single track or maybe a dual stereo track. But by the mid-60s we have the 4-track, and by the late 60s we have the 8-track. And what this meant is certain musicians were able to utilize that to create compositional elements that were advanced. Bands no longer need to just rehearse the song in their rehearsal room or on the gig and then just turn up and have the photograph taken of their sound. They now could use the studio to create compositions. This, I think, is the integral genesis of progressive rock. It is the coming together of rock music as a popular form of music with that recording technology. But the question we want to ask is why the bands of the 60s wanted to go towards that direction. It's interesting that people like the Beatles and the Stones, the Kinks, the Who, bands that had grown up listening to skiffle, which really came back from black folk music from America, people like Leadbelly. Why musicians that had started there when they got to the 1960s wanted to utilize this rock and roll to create something that was aligned much more artistic vision and weight of classical music in a rock format. Now, of course, on a single, you could sing about an event, going downtown to meet some girls driving around in a car. Singles are perfect for that, but on an album, you can tell a story. The bands in the 1960s, faced with this technology, some of them realized that they can make artistic statements that are bigger than anybody has ever made before. They don't need to be able to read music. They don't need to be classically trained. They don't need to know all the ranges of pitch of all the instruments in an orchestra or how to arrange chords across string sections. Those skills aren't required. What's required is just simply their imagination and people around them with the technical skill to realize their imagination using a recording studio. I would say the person in music history that allows that to happen is Bob Dylan. Now, that's a good place to start. Bob Dylan is rooted deeply into American folk music. He has brought that, and he has brought that up to date to a 60s audience. And this 60s audience are in a cultural revolution. They don't want to live the lives of their parents. They've been born at the time of the Second World War. There's been so much upheavals. And then the affluence that was created in the wake of that, especially in America in the 1950s, creates this idea of the teenager. And the teenager just now has some sort of autonomy. And what do they want to do with their lives? The one thing they don't want to do is dress and act like their parents and get the same job as their parents. And so there's a revolution that happens. What Bob Dylan does is he looks to this American folk music, a music that runs deeply in his country and his fellow people. And he sees, by taking the lead from Woody Guthrie, he can sing about modern ideas, modern thoughts and feelings of that generation using that form of music. In doing this, he moves away from singing songs about driving around in cars and meeting girls. And he does this as the album emerges. A chance meeting with the Beatles in 1964 is not just revolutionary for the Beatles in realising that Dylan's a serious songwriter and they can write serious songs on serious matters, but also Bob Dylan, seeing the success of the Beatles, realises that he could transfer his acoustic folk music into an electric setting. The albums he makes around about 1964 and 1965 democratise rock music. It allows people to go further out and express themselves. In other words, it allows them to be serious, and serious in all sorts of ways. Musicians respond to this straight away. This influence for contemporary music fans is actually quite hard to get. People don't understand how an artist like Frank Zappa was given permission to make an album like Freak Out when he heard Bob Dylan. And we could say pretty categorically, I think, that the beginning of progressive rock lies with that album that was recorded in 1965 and released in 1966. Zappa is surrounded by a whole bunch of American bands that have come out on the tails of Bob Dylan, who are also pushing the envelope, notably bands like Love or The Doors. But the same thing is going on the other side of the Atlantic in the UK. The UK has played a huge part in taking American music forms like rock and roll and the blues and combining them with what I call the English aesthetic. This would be the idea of combining with European classical music, perhaps, the English literary tradition, maybe even musical, or even surreal comedy like Monty Python and the Goons. The British are enamoured with American culture, but some musicians wonder how they can bring their Britishness into rock and roll. These two elements go together very well. The Beatles can be seen in expanding the language of rock and roll by moving to elements that they'd grown up with, primarily the Goons, Music Hall, Edward Lear, Alice in Wonderland. This surreal humour finds its way in with the Beatles, and a magical thing has happened in that their producer, George Martin, before working for the Beatles, had been the actual engineer using his compositional studio skills to create albums for the Goons and Peter Sellers. I feel that that is a very important aspect in the beginnings of progressive rock. When we discuss the Beatles, of course, they're not the only band doing this. Bands like the Rolling Stones, the Kinks, the Animals, the Yardbirds, the Who are all moving in a similar direction. The difference with the Beatles is the Beatles are so huge in the UK and in the US of A that their influence is all powerful. And their influence changes culture. If members of the Beatles start taking drugs, then the general public think, oh, maybe I might take drugs. If the members of the Beatles are going out to India to get all spiritual, then the general public think they should do this. The Beatles have a place where they are allowed to be as outlandish as they possibly can. This is unique in commercial music. The Beatles in 1963 start off as a pop band playing a British version of rhythm, blues and rock and roll. But a few years later, they are in the business of being outlandish, of pushing the envelope. Their albums utilize the recording studio to push further out. And the elements they bring in are the aforementioned elements from classical music, the English literary tradition, music hall. Having Martin involved, he could actually arrange their songs for string quartet, or he could bring in classical trumpet players to give a certain sound. The Beatles' impact in America is huge, that it affects other bands. In the same way as the Beatles had utilised music hall to expand their sound, in America, one of the biggest American bands at that time was the Beach Boys. And the Beach Boys have utilised barbershop quartet to expand their sound, combining that with rhythm and blues and rock and roll. Brian Wilson, the genius behind the Beach Boys, is jealous of what the Beatles are doing. And his band, the Beach Boys, are very clever in their utilisations of quite complex harmonies within a sort of surf rock context. But he wants to take it further out. His influence that he gets from the Beatles is not one of love, it's more one of jealousy. So he sets around in 1966 to make an album that utilises the recording studio to the max. He is pulling influences from not only the Beatles, but also from Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention. In fact, Brian Wilson is utilising a lot of the same session musicians and production techniques that Zappa is using at the same time. When the Beatles hear Pet Sounds, the album that comes out of these sessions, a competition emerges and they feel that they need to push the envelope out even more. These albums that are huge selling means that here in the UK, the record companies start to go and look for other bands that are making that sort of music. And a number of bands are signed at that time, most notably Procol Harum, The Nice and Pink Floyd. And I would say those are the three bands that are very important post-Beatles around about 1966-67 for taking that idea and pushing it forward. Pink Floyd had come off playing in the UFO Club in London. London had become a sort of cultural centre for the whole world. What was going on there was very exciting in the eyes of the whole world. People wanted to be in London. They wanted to be able to go down to the UFO Club, get a bit off their face, and listen to the psychedelic sounds of whatever band was there. And Pink Floyd was that band. Plus, they had a leader and a songwriter that was more charismatic than anybody that was in the Beatles. And of course, this was Syd Barrett. This is a no-brainer. And Pink Floyd are brought into Abbey Road at the same time that the Beatles are recording Sgt. Pepper. They record their own Sgt. Pepper, and their debut album is another stage forward in the development of progressive rock. The whimsy of Syd Barrett's songs combined with the psychedelic improvisations of the rest of the band become one of the cornerstones of progressive rock. Bands like Procol Harum and The Nice are utilising classical elements, and they're using those elements to arrange tracks that are longer and more profound. Also, we have the power trios of Cream and the Jimi Hendrix Experience that are taking this idea of the instrumental band of virtuosity and making that something which is commercially viable. Before these bands, most rock and roll bands have been kids forming a band in their garage, or garage, as they see it in the US. But now you're getting the idea of the supergroup, musicians who are far more advanced and skillful being brought together because of their skill, not necessarily mates, just people that are on the scene and are musically talented. I believe that this idea, which links into the authenticity, which is the fundamental building block of what Dylan was trying to do and what rock and roll was trying to do, creates this schism with the critics. In much the same way as we look back at people like Frank Sinatra and Ella Fitzgerald, and we see they're brilliant, but we see that they're not singing their own songs. We feel that Bob Dylan doesn't have to sing like Frank Sinatra or Ella Fitzgerald because he is singing his own lyrics. He is making his own statement. The Beatles are almost like the first self-contained band. They write the songs, they perform the songs, they front the songs, and they create the songs with their producer in the studio. Now, I have to say this as well, because it's something I haven't ever said on this channel. The Beatles did not invent the self-contained band, and I do believe I said that at some point. Of course, it was Buddy Holly that invented the self-contained band. But Buddy had died in 1959, and that's often named the day the music died. That was the death of the simplicity, youthful exuberance of rock and roll. But Buddy Holly passed on something else to bands like the Beatles, and it was this authentic idea of the artist creating as well as performing. Progressive rock definitely fulfilled that idea. But what it didn't do was be the voice of young people coming together, working class, from the street, and sticking it to their man by sitting in their garage and writing songs. That whole punk ethos also starts to emerge by the late 60s. This is happening in America with groups like MC5 and the Stooges and then the New York Dolls and eventually the Ramones. This idea of guys that know each other, right, they can't necessarily play, but they're going to use the visceral catharticness of rock and roll to express their position. Prog's no longer like that. We have virtuoso musicians, usually highly educated musically, but also from a literary point of view. Many have gone to art college, and they are interested in elevating rock and roll up from its low, earthy roots. This creates a split in the music. But the thing is, as we move into the 70s, is the album has become the art form for culture. This is a period before video cassette recorders. It's a period before cable television and then the internet and on demand. In the early 70s, if you want to watch a television program, you would have to wait for it to be on. And you could watch it while it was on, and when it was finished, it was gone. And you watched it on a pokey little television with the sound coming out of a tiny little speaker. But the television has become the centre of entertainment for people. Here in the UK, in the early 70s, things aren't going so great. We're getting power cuts. We're getting 3-day weeks. People are stuck in their houses, often sitting there in candlelight, telling each other jokes and stories. People can't afford to go out. When the electricity's put back on, they have their televisions and they have their hi-fi systems. Now, a hi-fi system brings into your living room a huge emotional experience, which exists in 3 dimensions. Bands that are bringing out progressive rock, they suddenly are swept up with this whole hi-fi LP experience that people want. They no longer want a 4-minute song. What they want is to be able to sit down and be taken on a journey. And these progressive rock bands give them that experience. How far can the audience go? Well, it seems almost bottomless. And from the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper in 1967 to the heights of albums like Dark Side of the Moon, Tubular Bells, Close to the Edge in 1973, that short journey of merely 6 years sees bands pushing what the audience can take and utilising the technical innovations that are coming from recording studio technology. By 1970, recording studios are becoming 8-track, in some cases 16-track. Frank Zappa, who had owned a recording studio before he was famous and understood the studio more than anybody else, is pushing this to the limit. His Hot Rats album in 1970s pushes multitracking to the limit. All the way through this history, Frank Zappa is leading the way in terms of progressive rock. But all the other innovations are happening on the other side of the Atlantic in the UK. I often joke that, progressive rock is English and only English people can make progressive rock. This is, of course, ridiculous. And I would argue that Frank Zappa's contribution to music is equal to all of the British progressive rock bands. And we can see in bands like Soft Machine and Van der Graaf Generator and a whole host of other bands that they are taking their lead directly from Frank Zappa. A few days ago, Don Powell from Slade is not a band that you would expect to be brought up in the history of progressive rock. But of course, Slade were working at exactly the same time as the Beatles were pushing the envelope. And on the first Slade album in 1969, they can be heard doing a Frank Zappa track. I'll actually let Don tell you the story. Your first album, when you were Ambrosia Slade, you did a Frank Zappa track.
Yeah.
Why?
Ain't Got No Heart.
Ain't Got No Heart? What's that about?
It was from the Mother's Invention Freak Out album. And don't ask me how we got that. It might have been Jim Lee, actually, who got the album. And we were impressed with that particular song. And it was a great stage song. And when we did the first album, believe it or not, was just a recording test for Fontana Records at the time. Yeah. And obviously, that album is our stage show from the time. Of course, Ain't Got No Heart. It was obviously including that. And the fantastic thing was, we were in London doing a press thing, and Frank Zappa was there.
No way, because I'm a massive Frank Zappa fan.
Yeah, great. And he was so impressed with us, especially with Jim Lee's bass playing.
It's a fantastic version. I think it's better than the Mothers.
That's a great album. We used to play that album, Freak Out, it was called, the Mothers.
When you were Ambrosia Slade...
Ambrose Slade, Ambrose is a rice.
It isn't. But if we move back to the UK, we see these bands pushing the envelope. Now in Europe, that influence of bands pushing the envelope is being felt. Influence is coming from the UK and the US. But in 1968 in Paris, we have the revolutions where the students took to the streets. The progressive rock that emerges in Europe, especially the music of krautrock, is far more revolutionary. I always felt that krautrock is almost like a different genre to progressive rock. Although Europe produced bands like Focus and the Italian bands like Le Orme and PFM, which are out-and-out progressive rock bands like Faust and Magma and Can, a completely different thing altogether. And I wish I was educated enough to give that history more justice. You never know, it may come in the future. But by 1973, these progressive rock bands have pushed the nature of rock and roll to its limit. And I think those bands start to realise that limit has been met. In 1974, there's evidence across all the progressive rock bands that they're wondering where to go next. Many of them are taking time off to do solo albums. Yes, take a break in 1973 to do a number of different solo albums, exploring all sorts of different areas. ELP tried to do the same thing, but selling their solo stuff as part of the ELP catalogue, and it didn't quite work. Other bands just run out of steam, or they start to pull in their approach. The departure of Peter Gabriel to go and make non-prog elsewhere, and then the departure of Steve Hackett from Genesis actually pulls and reins in Genesis. And by the 1980s, many of these bands have taken their progressive rock approaches, drawn them in, and have turned into out-and-out pop groups. The influence of progressive rock on 80s pop cannot be overestimated. It is absolutely huge. And the narrative that exists around about disco and punk, that in some way destroyed progressive rock, has skewed that narrative. And that has been one of the most important aspects of music criticism that I have tried to challenge on this channel. But on this video, I just wanted to give a quick overview of the roots of progressive rock, because this format here of me just talking in a tighter, more controlled way, being able to make specific points and create little documentaries for people who are new to these genres to explore and to start and see where they need to go, then I would really like to start to explore the little histories of some of these lesser known bands. But for those of you who are new to the genre and you want to go and get the albums that are essential to understand the birth of progressive rock, I would say you would need to buy Sgt. Pepper by the Beatles. You would need to buy Piper at the Gates of Dawn by Pink Floyd. You would need to get In the Court of the Crimson King by King Crimson, that came out in 1969 and can really be seen as all the elements coming together to form progressive rock. Days of Future Past by the Moody Blues would be a great choice to see how a sort of 60s rock and roll band takes an orchestra and brings that into their sound to make their sound orchestral. Albums by Procol Harum, albums by The Nice would be very useful acquisitions as well. And so that is my description and explanation of the birth of progressive rock. If you like this video, please like it. If you want to hear more stuff like this, drop it in the comments and subscribe. And if you want to support me financially, you can become a Patreon, or you can support me by putting a donation into my YouTube PayPal tip jar. Thanks for listening, thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next video.